Few philosophical statements have been more quoted and more misunderstood than Nietzsche's declaration that God is dead. It is often taken as a triumphant slogan of atheism, a boast that religion has finally been defeated by reason. Nietzsche meant nothing of the sort. In fact, he believed this reading missed the entire point. Nietzsche was not announcing a discovery, he was issuing a diagnosis. God is dead does not mean that a divine being once existed and now no longer does. It means that belief in God has lost its binding force in Western culture. The idea no longer structures how people live, value, and understand the world, even if they still profess belief in it. This is why Nietzsche presents the death of God as a cultural event rather than a philosophical argument. It is not something caused by one book, one thinker, or one scientific discovery. It is the result of centuries of intellectual honesty, gradually undermining inherited belief. Science, historical criticism, and moral inquiry did not set out to kill God. They made belief psychologically untenable. Importantly, Nietzsche did not celebrate this development. He feared it. God, in Nietzsche's view, had functioned as the deepest foundation of meaning, value, and order. To remove that foundation without replacing it was not liberation. It was destabilization. The death of God did not answer humanity's problems. It exposed them. This is why Nietzsche mocks those who treat atheism as a moral upgrade. Simply no longer believing in God does not free a culture from religious thinking. Moral habits, value structures, and concepts of truth persist long after their metaphysical grounding has vanished. Nietzsche believed modern people continued to think morally as if God still existed, but without being able to justify why. God is dead, therefore, names a condition, not a victory. It describes a culture living on borrowed moral capital, repeating values whose source it no longer believes in. This creates a tension that cannot be sustained indefinitely. Either values must be regrounded or they will collapse into emptiness. Nietzsche's insight was not that religion was false. It was that modern culture no longer genuinely believed what it claimed to believe, and had not yet faced the consequences. The death of God is not an answer. It is the beginning of a problem. Nietzsche gives his most vivid account of the death of God not in a philosophical argument, but in a parable. In The Gay Science, he introduces the figure of the madman. A man who runs into the marketplace in broad daylight, lantern in hand, crying out that he is looking for God. The crowd laughs at him. They are atheists, unbelievers, confident that God is already gone. And yet Nietzsche insists they have not understood what has happened. The madman announces that we have killed him, not through violence, but through indifference, honesty, and the slow erosion of belief. God did not die because people stopped believing overnight. God died because the intellectual habits that sustained belief were dismantled piece by piece. Faith lost its credibility long before it lost its language. What shocks the madman is not disbelief but incomprehension. The crowd does not grasp the scale of the event. They think the death of God changes very little. Nietzsche thinks it changes everything. Without God, the entire structure of meaning that supported truth, morality, and purpose begins to wobble. The madman asks terrifying questions. What were we doing when we unchained the earth from its sun? Where is it moving now? Are we not falling endlessly? These images are not poetic excess. They express Nietzsche's conviction that the death of God is an existential earthquake. God had functioned as the ultimate reference point, the horizon against which all values were measured. Without that horizon, orientation itself becomes difficult. Right and wrong, true and false, meaningful and meaningless lose their absolute anchoring. Crucially, the madman realizes he has come too early. The event has already happened, but its consequences have not yet been felt. Cultures move slowly. People continue to live as if the old foundations still hold. Churches remain standing. Moral language persists. Rituals continue. But beneath them, belief has hollowed out. Nietzsche believed this lag was dangerous. A culture that has lost its foundations but refuses to acknowledge the loss becomes unstable. It oscillates between moral certainty and existential emptiness. It clings to values it can no longer justify and reacts violently when those values are questioned. The madman smashes his lantern and declares that he has come too soon. His message will not be heard yet. Nietzsche understood himself in the same way. He was not announcing a new age. He was warning of a reckoning to come, one that would take generations to unfold. The madman is not insane because he denies God. He is insane because he understands what God's absence means. To understand why the death of God mattered so deeply to Nietzsche, it is necessary to understand what God was doing in Western culture. God was not merely an object of belief or worship. God functioned as the ultimate foundation, the final reference point that gave coherence to truth, morality, and meaning. For centuries, God guaranteed that the world was intelligible. Truth was not just what worked or what persuaded, but what aligned with a divine order. Morality was not a human invention, but a reflection of an objective moral structure embedded in reality itself. Meaning was not something fragile or provisional, but something secured by purpose beyond human life. Nietzsche believed that once God disappeared, these structures did not simply vanish. They lingered, detached from their source. People continued to speak of truth as if it were absolute, morality as if it were binding, and meaning as if it were guaranteed. But the justification for these claims had quietly evaporated. This created a profound contradiction. Modern culture, Nietzsche argued, wanted the fruits of religion without the roots. It wanted moral certainty without metaphysical commitment. It wanted universal values without a universal foundation. God was gone, but his shadow remained, cast across ethics, science, and politics. Nietzsche believed this shadow would not last forever. Values cannot float indefinitely without grounding. Either they are recreated consciously or they decay into hollow slogans enforced by habit, emotion, or power. When belief collapses but moral language persists, morality becomes brittle. It turns from a shared orientation into a weapon. This is why Nietzsche insisted that science could not simply replace God. Science describes how the world works. It does not tell us why it matters or how we should live. Treating science as a moral foundation is, for Nietzsche, a category error. Facts cannot generate values. Knowledge cannot replace meaning. The death of God, therefore, does not produce freedom by default. It produces responsibility. If values are no longer given, they must be created. If meaning is no longer guaranteed, it must be affirmed. This is not liberation for everyone. Nietzsche believed most people would find it unbearable. God, as a cultural foundation, had performed a stabilizing role. Its disappearance exposed the terrifying openness of existence. Nietzsche did not mourn this loss sentimentally, but he refused to underestimate it. The death of God did not remove an illusion. It removed a structure and left humanity standing without a ground beneath its feet. Once God no longer functions as the ultimate foundation, Nietzsche believed something unavoidable follows. Meaning begins to collapse. Not instantly and not uniformly, but slowly and unevenly. The values that once oriented human life lose their authority, yet nothing equally strong steps in to replace them. Nietzsche did not think this collapse would feel dramatic at first. On the contrary, it would feel banal. Life would continue much as before. Institutions would remain. Moral language would persist. People would still speak of purpose, justice, and truth. But beneath this surface continuity, something essential would be missing. Confidence that these words refer to anything real. Meaning, for Nietzsche, is not merely a personal feeling. It is a shared horizon. A sense that life fits into a larger order that makes demands on us. When that horizon disappears, individuals are left to improvise. Some respond by clinging more tightly to old values, enforcing them with greater aggression precisely because they no longer believe in them. Others drift into indifference, boredom, or quiet despair. This is where Nietzsche introduces the concept of nihilism, not as a philosophy, but as a condition. Nihilism is what happens when the highest values devalue themselves, when the ideals that once gave life meaning are exposed as human constructions without grounding. They lose their power to compel belief. Life begins to feel arbitrary, weightless, and exhausted. Nietzsche believed modern people already lived inside this condition, even if they lacked the language to describe it. The feeling that nothing truly matters, that moral outrage replaces purpose, that distraction replaces direction. These were not accidents. They were symptoms of a culture surviving after the death of its deepest justifications. Importantly, Nietzsche did not think nihilism was caused by too much skepticism. He believed it was caused by half-honesty. People were honest enough to abandon God, but not honest enough to confront the consequences. They wanted meaning without responsibility, values without creation, purpose without risk. This collapse of meaning creates a dangerous vacuum. When meaning is no longer given, it does not simply disappear. It seeks substitutes. Ideologies, moral crusades, identity and resentment rush in to fill the gap. These substitutes often appear intense and righteous, but they lack depth. They cannot sustain life. They exhaust it. For Nietzsche, the collapse of meaning was not a tragedy to be avoided at all costs. It was an unavoidable phase, a clearing of the ground. But whether that clearing would lead to renewal or decay depended on how it was faced. The death of God does not immediately destroy meaning. It reveals that meaning was never guaranteed and must now be confronted honestly. One of Nietzsche's most unsettling claims is that science cannot replace God, not because science is false, but because it does a fundamentally different kind of work. Modern culture, Nietzsche believed, misunderstood this distinction and paid the price for it. Science explains how the world functions. It uncovers patterns, causal relationships, and mechanisms. It increases power, prediction, and control. What it does not do is generate values. It cannot tell us why truth matters, why knowledge should be pursued, or why life is worth living at all. These commitments must already be in place before science can operate. Nietzsche believed modern people quietly smuggled moral assumptions into science while pretending to have abandoned morality altogether. They spoke of truth as something sacred, objectivity as something virtuous, and knowledge as something unquestionably good, without recognizing that these are value judgments, not scientific conclusions. In this way, science inherited the moral role of religion without acknowledging the inheritance. This substitution was unstable. God once guaranteed that truth was worth pursuing because it aligned with a divine order. When God disappeared, the devotion to truth remained, but without justification. Why prefer truth to illusion? Why value knowledge over comfort? Science cannot answer these questions without appealing to values it does not create. Nietzsche saw this as another example of living on borrowed meaning. Science continued the ascetic ideal under a new name, sacrificing comfort, illusion, and instinct in the name of truth, but without admitting its religious ancestry. Scientists became priests without knowing it. Laboratories replaced churches. Objectivity replaced salvation. This is why Nietzsche did not celebrate scientific progress uncritically. He admired its discipline and honesty, but he feared its moral emptiness. Science could tell us what is, but not what ought to be. When treated as a replacement for God, it produced a culture rich in information and poor in orientation. The danger, Nietzsche believed, was not that science would destroy meaning, but that it would pretend meaning was no longer needed. In reality, values would continue to operate invisibly, enforced by habit, power, or resentment rather than belief. A culture that mistakes explanation for justification becomes efficient, not meaningful. For Nietzsche, the death of God revealed a hard truth. No amount of knowledge can tell us why knowledge matters. Science sharpens the problem of meaning rather than solving it. God did not die so that science could rule. He died leaving a question science cannot answer. Nietzsche did not believe the death of God led to a single outcome. It opened a crossroads. Faced with the collapse of inherited meaning, cultures and individuals could respond in fundamentally different ways. Nietzsche called these responses passive nihilism and active nihilism. Passive nihilism is resignation. It recognizes that old values no longer command belief, but it lacks the strength to create new ones. Life is experienced as drained of purpose, yet nothing replaces what has been lost. Comfort, distraction, and safety become substitutes for meaning. Pleasure is pursued not as joy, but as anesthesia. Nietzsche believed passive nihilism was already widespread in modern culture. It expresses itself through boredom, cynicism, irony, and endless entertainment. People continue to function, but without direction. They avoid risk, avoid intensity, and avoid responsibility. Life becomes something to be managed rather than lived. Active nihilism, by contrast, is destructive, but deliberately so. It recognizes that false values must be cleared away before anything new can emerge. Active nihilism does not mourn the collapse of meaning. It attacks the remnants of dead values that still claim authority. It says, if these values no longer justify life, they should not survive out of habit. This distinction is crucial. Nietzsche did not endorse destruction for its own sake. Active nihilism is not vandalism, it is preparation. It clears the ground by exposing illusions and dismantling moral structures that no longer correspond to life. Only after this clearing, Nietzsche believed, could genuine creation begin. Most people, Nietzsche thought, would recoil from this stage. Destruction feels dangerous. It removes certainty. It demands courage. This is why cultures often prefer passive nihilism. It is quieter. It allows daily life to continue without confrontation. But Nietzsche saw it as more dangerous in the long run. It leads to stagnation, resentment, and a slow erosion of vitality. Nietzsche's fear was not that people would lose belief in God. It was that they would lose belief without realizing it, drifting into passive nihilism while insisting they were morally superior and intellectually enlightened. This produces a culture of moral certainty without depth, outrage without purpose, and activity without direction. Active nihilism, though painful, at least takes the problem seriously. It acknowledges the collapse and refuses to live on borrowed meaning. It is a transitional stage, not an end point. Nietzsche believed something must come after nihilism, but it could only come if nihilism was faced honestly rather than anesthetized. The death of God does not tell us what to do. It forces us to choose how we respond. Nietzsche believed the most dangerous aspect of the death of God was not disbelief, but delay. The event had already occurred, yet its consequences had not been fully lived through. Cultures continued to operate on moral assumptions whose foundations had eroded, producing tension, confusion, and instability. Nietzsche thought this condition would last for generations. What makes this diagnosis still haunting is how familiar it feels. Modern societies speak the language of moral certainty while lacking agreement on why anything should matter at all. Values are asserted loudly, defended aggressively, and enforced socially, yet rarely justified. Moral disagreement feels existential because there is no shared foundation beneath it. Nietzsche anticipated this. He believed that when meaning collapses, it does not disappear quietly. It reappears in distorted forms: ideological rigidity, moral absolutism without grounding, and emotional intensity detached from purpose. People cling to causes not because they offer truth, but because they offer orientation. This is why Nietzsche did not see the death of God as a purely intellectual problem. It was psychological and cultural. Humans need meaning the way they need air. When it is no longer given, it will be created, consciously or unconsciously, honestly or dishonestly. The danger lies in unconscious creation, where values harden into dogma without reflection. Nietzsche feared a future in which people would neither believe deeply nor create courageously. Instead, they would moralize reflexively, consume endlessly, and resent quietly. This was the soil from which the last man would grow, a figure who wants comfort, safety, and recognition, but fears risk, struggle, and responsibility. Yet Nietzsche did not end in despair. He believed the death of God made something unprecedented possible. The conscious creation of values. This possibility was terrifying and not for everyone. It demanded strength, discipline, and honesty without guarantees, but it was the only alternative to stagnation. The death of God is therefore not a conclusion. It is an open wound. It continues to shape modern life precisely because it has not been confronted directly. We live in its aftermath, surrounded by values we did not choose, defending meanings we no longer believe in. Nietzsche's question still stands, unresolved. Can human beings live without absolute foundation and still affirm life honestly? That question will define everything that follows in this series.